Okay, well, welcome to this week's SNES Divination. This week has been a bit crazy, to be honest. The process has been strange. I messed up the random numbers. I had to do this again with a completely different set of games. There's just been a weird, sort of chaotic vibe about this reading. Um, but it's also, and I just sort of want to share it because I think it might go into the reading. It's somehow been in synchrony with personal synchronicities of mine, which hadn't happened so much with past readings. So I feel like there is a weird, chaotic trickster energy to this reading, which is funny because I think this is part of what I perceive in the reading itself. There is also like a, as I said, the reading itself tied into personal synchronicities of mine, and I also felt compelled to use alternate album art. I mean, game art, which I don't usually do, but anyway. So yeah, a bit of a weird one. Anyway, the themes I think are not that many. There is a clear thing about shielded eyes, which had appeared in the past, right? His eyes are covered. He's wearing glasses. He's wearing these sort of goggle things. He's got his eyes covered. It's kind of the old medieval equivalent of this, right? Just a general like helmet that covers your face, but with the eyes being highlighted in the other images. And then this is the other example, right? It's not both his eyes, but I mean this is a bit of a strange shadowy eye anyway. So yeah, definitely something about the eyes, right? The eyes are being highlighted. It's hard to know how. One way in which they're being highlighted, for example, is that lock on, we see that like the gun is locking on to its target, and its target is this guy's or woman's forehead. So we have the third eye theme again, which had come up in other readings, but the goggles are reflecting an explosion. So it's as if, again, a weird sort of like third eye thing I read it as, right? That something is blowing up in this person's vision, and it's a red explosion in the center of this person's vision, right? Perhaps all of these images with their covering of the eyes, it kind of turns the eyes into a single panel. It erases the illusion of the twin eyes and fuses them together. What makes me say this is just, this image, for example, or this. There's a sort of Cyclops vibe to this, maybe, which obviously gets echoed here in the highlighting of one eye over the other. Okay. The second thing I perceive is red eye, right? Clearly a red eye. The explosion, if we were to take it as a central eye, would also be red, but I understand that that's just my own interpretation of it, so I want to offer other kind of slightly harder evidence, if you want to call it that. Okay, the dragon's eye is red, and Mighty Max, one of the alternate covers, also features the heroes being sort of devoured or in the grip of a beast that overpowers them and whose eyes are red. To end the eye segment of this, the alternate cover of Heart of the Maelstrom is literally an eye at the heart of the tornado, an eye at the heart of the spiral. Okay, so sort of like if we just take these two covers there is a sort of a beast, a dragon, right? The villain in Mighty Max is sort of like a beastly character as well, who is like at the center of a spiral that is threatening to devour you, or something like that. And yet, all these images, in conjunction with the past readings from other weeks, seem to suggest that this is somehow about the third eye, or third eye and crown chakra, sort of general head area chakra activation, which, in certain schools of thought would be associated with something positive. But I think that these readings are signaling the, maybe not the negative, but the scary parts of this. The fact that the ego dissolving quality of the experience of, let's say, the third eye. I mean, I don't even know if I want to call it that. Let's say that at least the symbolic opening of the third eye, as shown by these images, it can be anything else really, seems to be associated with fear or something threatening, right? There is a threat. The guy's sort of protecting from something, and this person's protecting from something also in this general direction. Okay, so that's interesting. That's one part of the reading. Then, the second part of the reading, I think, has to do with the sword. And it's not as extensive, maybe, but there are just enough clear sword images to make me wonder about this. There's a sword here and a sword in Mighty Max. So the image of the sword-wielding hero is present in both these two. Now, again, as I said, this was a weird, chaotic reading. I did it first, but I messed up the random numbers, so I felt like I needed to start it again. And the original reading with the original numbers that I did also featured swords. So, yeah. Anyway, let's just leave it at that for now. Let's see. Okay. Now, the sword, in the context, in the context of all this third eye stuff, I can't help but read the sword in just the traditional, like, mystical sense of the spinal column, and then the tip of the sword being the third eye or crown. There's something about the vertical sword, with here the characters in a sort of cross position. But of course, I wouldn't read it that way if it wasn't for the context of this reading and past readings. So, not exactly sure what to make of it at the moment. But let's just say that for the time being, my hypothesis is that there is a chakric bundle of images here having to do with the third eye and the pillar or sword ascending up to it. Okay. So, and of course, the other main thing here is the logo of wizardry also features this sort of vertical sword. So that's actually three instances of the sword motif in these games. Right. Now, to go on to slightly the more abstract ideas that I see here, there is, as I said, this idea I feel of the third eye, or the dissolving of the ego, being something scary to the ego, being simultaneously a liberation of energies within the self. So it is a victory for the self, but it is in some sense a defeat of the ego, and this is not to be celebrated by the ego. So there is a weird paradox here where the ego is both attaining some sort of a liberation from past habits, from karma, whatever you want to call it, but at the same time, it is there is a defeat. There is a liberation and there is a defeat. Anyway, I think that this gets expressed in an interesting way. Okay, in past readings, I got this vibe of the dead coming out from the underworld, or animals being liberated. But the way it appeared in other readings was that the ego or the central character would somehow discover the animals in the underworld, and then one would assume that upon being discovered, the animals would then be liberated. So there was this safe image, safe for the ego, of the ego descends down into the underworld and liberates the dead, right? Here, however, I get the feeling that there is something else in this image, in this motif, which is precisely this defeat of the ego, this surrender of the ego. That the ego doesn't just descend into the underworld and that's it, you know. The ego's descent into the underworld is ego death. It is the death of the ego. So, the ego is devoured by the animal, or the spirit, or whatever you want to call it. The liberation of the dead. So the dead coming alive is the ego dying. There is a bit of both. It's not like, you know, the ego's alive and it helps the dead to come alive and now everyone's alive and everyone's happy. There is a bit of a weird alchemical thing here where, no, in fact, the ego dies and the animal comes alive, the spirit comes alive. So it's as if this reading is correcting that or highlighting that, which in past readings had not come out so clearly, in my opinion. Because I definitely get this feeling from these images that the ego is being defeated by the underworld. It's not the victory of the hero. It's the victory of the dead, but, of course, with this alchemical weird loop where the dead is part of the self in the psyche. So the resurrection of the dead is a victory for the self as a whole, but involves the death of the ego. Something like that. Okay, how does this play out in the other covers? Again, a very intuitive sort of reading of these, personally. For instance, I get this feeling here that it's a victory for the animals, right? The animals are reaching their goal. In the past readings, the animals were representative somehow of spirit or the dead or the elements that were trapped in the underworld. So here it's as if the animals have escaped the underworld. They have achieved their goal of escaping out into the surface. But it's them who have escaped out into the surface. As a counterpoint to that, the ego descends down into the underworld. The descent of the ego into the underworld is the ascent of the animals out into the world. This, for example, I'll keep pushover for later. Super Ghouls and Ghosts. The name already, it's the name of the game isn't the name of the hero or of the quest. It's almost as if the hero isn't the main object of this game. The main power behind this game are the ghouls and the ghosts. The hero is surrounded by ghouls and ghosts. Now, as a purely intuitive reading of this, I get the feeling that the hero here, or heroine, is surrounded, is somehow being defeated by the ghosts. The ghosts are too many. And they are the protagonists of the game, the title of the game. Okay, again, that's just without any like data to back it up. Just sort of my intuitive read. I get the feeling that these animals are celebrating their victory, as are these. These animals are celebrating their victory. They're coming out. Pushover then adds another aspect to this, which is that, well, first of all, this game is no pushover. So this game is tougher than it seems, right? It may seem like this is a microcosmic ant, but actually he's called Giant, right? So it's as if the microcosm takes on the form of the macrocosm. The ant is stronger than you thought. The dead, all of the elements of the unconscious that are considered to be trash and lifeless and just mere fantasy and dreams and just junk in the unconscious, is bigger and more alive than the ego thought. And them coming alive involves the death of the ego. So, yes, I find that very interesting. That's the vibe I get from this cover. And to be honest, I mean, I could go into like details and stuff, but I think that's more or less the main thing. I don't feel that anything else is wanting to be said. So, yeah, that's this week's reading. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.